A quiet park, a sunny afternoon, and one woman minding her own business until a gang of men surrounded her thinking they had found an easy target. What they didn't know, she was a Navy SEAL. What happens next will leave you stunned. Before we start the story, comment below where you're watching from today, and if you enjoy this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. The park was calm that afternoon, the kind of pious that felt too perfect to last. The golden sunlight filtered through the branches, casting long shadows across the grass. Children's laughter echoed from the swings, blending with the faint chirping of birds. On a bench near the edge of the small pond, Morgan Blake sat quietly, taking in the rare moment of stillness. Her black leather jacket rested beside her, revealing a muscular build under a simple gray t-shirt. A faint scar on her forearm caught the sunlight, a subtle reminder of battles fought far from here. Morgan's eyes scanned the park more out of habit than suspicion. A jogger passed by, offering a polite nod, which she returned with a faint smile. Her years as a Navy SEAL had trained her to notice everything, details that most people missed. Her sharp instincts picked up on subtle shifts in the atmosphere, like the awkward shuffle of a man a few yards away, or the way a group of teenagers lingered by the playground a little too long. None of it felt dangerous, but something in the air made her uneasy. Across the park, four men stood under an old oak tree. Their voices carried sharp laughter, a kind that cut through the peaceful ambience. One of them, tall and broad-shouldered, leaned against the tree, his shaved head gleaming under the sunlight. Tattoos snaked up his neck, partially hidden by the black hoodie he wore. He nudged one of the others, a wiry man with a patchy beard, and pointed in Morgan's direction. She felt their stares before she saw them, her instincts flaring with a faint prickle down her spine. Turning her head slowly, she met their gaze, and they didn't look away. Morgan didn't react. She kept her posture relaxed, one arm draped casually over the back of the bench, the other resting on her lap. But her mind was working quickly. The men didn't blend in with the usual park goers. Their laughter wasn't the kind shared between friends. It had a mean edge to it. The way they shifted their way, the subtle smirks they exchanged, it all hinted at trouble. She noticed the leader movements as he stepped forward, his gait slow and deliberate. His companions followed, their voices growing louder, their tone carrying mockery and false confidence. They were closing the distance now, spreading out slightly as if circling prey. Morgan's muscles tensed slightly, though her calm expression didn't falter. She had faced worse before, and she wasn't about to show fear. Tank, the leader, finally stopped a few feet away, his voice dripping with mock politeness. "Afternoon, ma'am. Mighty nice day to be out here all alone, don't you think?" His grin was wide and arrogant, his words loud enough to catch the attention of a few bystanders who quickly looked away. Morgan looked up, meeting his gaze with an even expression. "It was," she said simply. "What do you want?" Her tone caught him off guard, but he recovered quickly, glancing back at his crew with a smirk. "No need to get defensive now, we're just friendly folks out for a chat." He gestured to the bag resting beside her on the bench. "That's a nice bag you've got there. Mind if we take a look?" Morgan's lips twitched, the faintest hint of a smirk playing at the corners. "That's not how politeness works," she said coolly. Her voice was steady, her words sharp enough to cut through the tension. Tank's face darkened, the humor in his tone dropping. "You know what I mean. Hand it over and we won't have any problems." Morgan's eyes flicked between the men, noting their stances and calculating their moves. She remained seated, her voice calm but edged with warning. "I think you've picked the wrong person today." Patchy Beard let out a sharp laugh, stepping closer. "Oh, look at her, thinks she's tough. You hear that, Tank? She's going to fight back." Tank leaned in, his smirk returning, but there was an edge to it. "Now we'll see about that." Morgan stood slowly, her movements deliberate though shorter than Tank. She carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had been through far worse than a few bullies in a park. Her gaze was unwavering, her voice low and measured. "Walk away. You won't like how this ends." For a moment there was silence. The men exchanged glances, their bravado faltering for the briefest second, but Tank's pride wouldn't let him back down. His smirk widened as he gestured to his crew. "She's got a mouth on her. Let's see How tough she really is. Morgan's stance shifted subtly, her weight balanced, her hands relaxed at her sides but ready, her instincts sharpened, and she braced herself. The moment was about to break, and she knew it wasn't going to end the way they expected. The gang didn't wait long before making their move. One of the younger men lunged at Morgan, his overconfidence showing in his sloppy attempt to grab her arm. She stepped aside effortlessly, twisting his wrist with a sharp motion that sent him sprawling onto the gravel path. He groaned, clutching his arm, his bravado replaced by shock. The other men froze momentarily, their expression shifting from amusement to disbelief. Tank's face hardened, his smirk fading. "Get her," he barked, his voice filled with frustration and a hint of something else, uncertainty. The second man, Patchy Beard, charged next. Swinging wildly at her, Morgan ducked under his strike and retaliated with a swift elbow to his chest. The force knocked him off balance and he stumbled backward, wheezing for air. She didn't give him a chance to recover, stepping forward and landing a precise kick to his knee that sent him collapsing onto the ground. Tank and the remaining man hesitated, their confidence visibly shaken. "Check, just a woman," Tank snarled. His companion, as if saying it aloud would make it true. "Don't just stand there, take her down." The third man stepped forward reluctantly, his movements less aggressive than his fallen friends. He swung a fist at Morgan, but she sidestepped, grabbing his arm and using his momentum against him. A sharp twist sent him crashing into a nearby bench where he lay groaning, his face pale with pain. Morgan turned to face Tank, her stance steady, her eyes locked on him. She could see the underscore in his demeanor now. The smug arrogance had cracked, replaced by anger and a flicker of doubt. "You really want to keep this going?" she asked, her voice calm but with a sharp edge. "Walk away while you still can." Tank's jaw tightened, his fists clenching at his sides. The other men were down but his pride wouldn't let him leave. He took a step forward, looming over her, his sheer size and attempt at intimidation. "You think you've won," he growled, his voice low and venomous. "You don't know who you're messing with." Morgan didn't flinch. "Neither do you." With a roar, Tank swung a massive fist at her, but Morgan was ready. She ducked under his punch and drove her elbow into his ribs. The impact forced him to stumble back, clutching his side. She followed up with a calculated low kick to his shin, throwing him off balance. He staggered, but stayed on his feet, his face contorted with pain and fury. The sound of distant sirens broke through the tension. Tank froze, his head snapping toward the sound. The police were on their way. His eyes darted to his crew, Patchy Beard still struggling to get up, the younger men groaning in pain on the ground. "This isn't over." Tank spat, his voice a mix of rage and desperation. He shot Morgan a final venomous glare before turning on his heel. "Let's go," he barked at his men. One by one they limped away, throwing curses and threats over their shoulders. Morgan didn't move, her gaze following them until they disappeared into the trees. Her breathing was steady, though her ribs ached from a poorly blocked punch. She stood still, her instinct scanning for any lingering threats until she was certain they were gone. The sirens grew louder, and within moments, 2 squad cars pulled up, their red and blue lights painting the park in flashes of color. Officers stepped out cautiously, their hands resting on their holstered weapons. "Ma'am, are you okay?" one of them asked, his tone firm but concerned. "We got a call about a disturbance." Morgan nodded, her voice steady despite the lingering adrenaline. "I'm fine, they're gone now." The officer's eyes scanned the scene, taking in the scuffed gravel, the bent bench and the faint scrape on Morgan's forearm. "Did they hurt you?" he asked. "Nothing I can't handle," she replied, her tone even. The officer frowned but nodded, pulling out a notepad. "Can you describe them?" Morgan hesitated for a moment, replaying the confrontation in her mind. The details came easily: Tank's shave head, the tattoos on his neck, the wiry frame of Patchy Beard, the overconfidence of the younger men. She relayed everything with sharp precision, her voice cold and measured. "They'll be back," she added, her gaze steady. "This wasn't just random. They thought they could intimidate me. They've done it before and they'll do it again." The officer's pen hovered over the notepad, his brow furrowing. "Meaning what?" "Meaning they've been targeting people," Morgan said, her tone hardening. "People like me, and they won't stop until someone makes them the Officer's expression darkened as he finished taking notes. We'll look into it, he said, but for now we'll need you to come down to the station and file a formal report. Morgan nodded, her jaw tightening. I'll be there. As the officers returned to their vehicles, Morgan stood alone for a moment, her body aching but her resolve unshaken. She knew this wasn't the end. Tank's parting words echoed in her mind, a challenge she had no intention of backing down from. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The fluorescent lights of the police station buzzed faintly as Morgan sat across from Officer Reyes, a young man with sharp eyes and a non-nonsense demeanor. His notebook lay open in front of him and he tapped a pen against the edge of the table as he studied her. Morgan's expression was calm but her body still hummed with adrenaline. The fight in the park was over but the gang's hateful words lingered in her mind. Let's start from the top. Miss Blake. Reese said, his voice steady. You said there were 4 men. Can you walk me through what happened? Morgan recounted the encounter in sharp, precise detail. Tank's mocking voice, patchy beards, crude remarks, the way they surrounded her like a pack of wolves. She spared no detail, her words cutting through the air like a knife. Reyes's pen moved quickly as she spoke, his expression growing darker with every word. When she finished, Reyes leaned back in his chair, his brow furrowed. This doesn't sound random, he said, his tone cautious. You're sure you've never seen these men before? I'm sure, Morgan replied. They weren't after my bag. That was just an excuse. They saw me sitting alone and thought I was an easy target. They wanted me to feel out of place. Reyes frowned, his pen hovering over the page. Why do you think they singled you out? Because I'm black, Morgan said bluntly, her jaw tightening. They didn't say it outright at first, but it was clear in everything they did, the way they looked at me, the comments they made. It wasn't random. Reyes nodded slowly, his pen scratching against the page again. We've had reports of similar incidents in the area, he admitted. Harassment, intimidation, minor assaults. It's been happening in public spaces mostly, but this sounds organized. Morgan's gaze didn't waver. It is those men were too confident. They've done this before and they'll do it again. Reyes sighed, closing his notebook with a faint snap. We'll run their descriptions through the system and see what comes up, but I'll be honest with you, Miss Blake, cases like this are hard to pin down. If victims don't press charges or there's no solid evidence, it's tough to build a case. Morgan's voice was sharp. Then find the evidence, because I'm not letting this slide. Reyes studied her for a moment, then gave a short nod. We'll do what we can. Later that night, Morgan sat at her kitchen table, her laptop open in front of her. The faint glow of the screen cast shadows across the room as she scrolled through local news reports. Her SEAL training had taught her to rely on herself when others couldn't or wouldn't act. If Reese needed more proof, she would find it. It didn't take long to uncover a disturbing pattern. Over the past 6 months there had been multiple reports of harassment and minor assaults across the area. The victims were always people of color and the descriptions of the attackers were chillingly consistent. A tall man with tattoos on his neck, a wiry figure with a patchy beard, younger men with cocky postures. Tank's gang. Morgan's jaw clenched as she read through the accounts. Many of the victims hadn't pressed charges, likely out of fear or frustration with the system, but their stories painted a clear picture. The attacks weren't about theft or random violence, they were about sending a message. Her phone buzzed on the table, breaking her concentration. It was a message from Sarah Carter, her best friend and a journalist known for chasing stories others avoided. Sarah heard about what happened. You okay? Call me. Morgan didn't hesitate. She hit the call button and Sarah picked up on the first ring. Morgan, Sarah said, her voice tinged with concern. I saw the news. Are you all right? I'm fine, Morgan said, her tone firm. But this isn't just about me. She explained everything: the attack in the park, the gang's hateful remarks, the pattern of harassment she'd uncovered. Sarah listened in silence, and when Morgan finished, her voice was grim. It sounds like this isn't just a group of punks, Sarah said. If they're this organized and targeting minorities, this could be a hate group. That's exactly what it is, Morgan replied, and I'm not letting them get away with it. Sarah sighed. I get it, but these people are Dangerous if you dig too deep. They came after me because they thought I'd back down. Morgan interrupted. Because they thought I'd just let it happen. They were wrong. There was a pause before Sarah spoke again, her tone resigned but supportive. What do you need? Anything you can find, Morgan said. Where they hang out? How long they been doing this? Why the police haven't stopped them? Anything? Sarah hesitated. I'll see what I can do. But promise me you'll be careful. These kinds of people don't take kindly to being exposed. I'll be careful, Morgan said, but her gaze stayed fixed on the laptop screen, her mind racing with possibilities she wasn't about to let fear stop her. Not now, not ever. The morning light crept through the blinds, as Morgan sat at her dining table, her laptop still glowing from the night's work. Beside it, a steaming cup of black coffee sat untouched. Her body was tired, but her mind wouldn't rest. She'd spent hours piecing together articles, social media posts and community forum threads, searching for more about Tank's gang and the larger operation. She was beginning to suspect a notification pinged on her screen. Sarah had come through, sending an email packed with links, notes and files tied to Tank and his crew. Morgan opened the first attachment, her eyes scanning over incident report rep's photos of graffiti and mentions of a network that extended beyond the city. It was worse than she thought. This wasn't just a gang of troublemakers, they were part of something larger, a coordinated effort to spread fear in minority communities. The deeper she looked, the clearer the picture became. The incidents weren't isolated in one neighborhood. Residents had reported a surge in harassment, vandalism and even physical assaults over the past year. Another area had seen similar activity. Each time the goal seemed the same: intimidate families until they moved out, leaving properties vacant, and devalued the trail led back to one name: Paul Hendrick. Morgan's jaw tightened as she read more about him. Hendrick was a well-known businessman who owned several construction companies. On the surface his record was clean, his public persona polished. He was active in the community, funding development projects and donating to local causes. But Sarah's notes hinted at a darker truth. Hendrick's construction firms were tied to shell companies that funneled money into these hate groups, supporting their activities while keeping his own hands clean. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was a call from Officer Reyes. She answered quickly, her tone sharp. What did you find? I ran the descriptions you gave me, Reyes said, his voice tight. Tank's name is Gary Walker. He's been arrested before: assault, vandalism, the usual. Patchy beard is Russell Hayes. Same story, but it gets worse. We've linked them to multiple incidents in the area. This isn't just street level stuff, it's coordinated. I know, Morgan replied. It leads back to Hendrick Heck using these gangs to clear out neighborhoods so he can buy up the properties on the cheap. Reyes sighed heavily. That's a big accusation, Blake. Do you have proof? Not yet, Morgan admitted, her frustration evident, but I'm working on it. What about you? We've been looking into Hendrick for a while, Reyes said. There have been whispers about him funding extremist groups, but nothing we can act on. He keeps everything at arm's length. If we're going to make a case, we'll need something concrete. Morgan's voice hardened. Then we make it concrete. Later that evening, Morgan met Sarah in a small coffee shop across town. The place was quiet, the hum of conversation blending with the hiss of an espresso machine. Sarah's laptop was already open when Morgan arrived, her expression a mix of exhaustion and determination. You were right, Sarah said, sliding a folder across the table. Hendrick isn't just funding these groups, he's directing them. The money flows through his shell companies to local gangs like Tank's. They're the ones on the ground, but the orders are coming from him. Morgan opened the folder, scanning the documents inside: bank transfers, anonymous donations, payments to community improvement projects that never existed. It was all there, a financial trail that linked Hendrick to the violence plaguing the city. Sarah leaned forward, her voice low. He's careful, he uses middlemen to keep his name out of it, but we've got enough to start connecting the dots. If we can link him directly to Tank's crew, it's over for him. Morgan's mind raced as she flipped through the files. What about Tank? If we can get him to talk, that's risky, Sarah interrupted. Men like Tank don't flip easily. Even if he's scared Hendrick's reach is long, he might decide it's safer to keep his mouth shut. Then We make him talk, Morgan said, her tone firm. Hendrik thinks he's untouchable because no one's been willing to push hard enough. That changes now. Sarah hesitated, glancing around the coffee shop before lowering her voice further. If you're going after them, you need to be careful. These people aren't just criminals, they're organized. They won't stop at intimidation. Morgan looked up, her gaze steady. Neither will I, Sarah sighed, leaning back in her chair. Just promise me you won't do this alone. Hendrik's dangerous, but Tank's the kind of man who'd do something reckless if he feels cornered. Morgan nodded, but her focus was already elsewhere. She had the piece of the puzzle now, she just needed to put them together. Tank and his crew were the key to taking Hendrik down, and Morgan wasn't about to let them slip through her fingers. The dim glow of street lights barely illuminated the rundown bar on the edge of town. The air outside was thick with the smell of oil and asphalt, and a faint bass line from inside vibrated through the cracked walls. Morgan sat in her car parked across the street, her eyes fixed on the entrance. This was Tank's usual spot. According to S research, it wasn't much, but it was the best lead she had. Two men lingered near the door, smoking and exchanging words in low tones. They didn't look like Tank's crew, but Morgan knew better than to assume they weren't connected. She adjusted her cap, pulled it lower over her face, and stepped out of the car. Her boots crunched softly against the gravel as she crossed the street, her movements calm and deliberate. Inside, the bar was just as grimy as she imagined, dimly lit, smoky, and filled with the low murmur of conversations that paused briefly when she entered. Heads turned for a moment, sizing her up before turning back to their drinks. Morgan moved toward the bar, her eyes scanning the room. Patchy Beard sat at a corner booth with one of the younger men from the park, their heads close as they talked in hushed voices. She recognized them instantly. The bartender, a wiry man with a tired face, looked up as Morgan approached. "What'll it be?" he asked, his tone gruff. "Information," Morgan replied, sliding a 20 bill across the counter. "I'm looking for someone." Big guy, shaved head, tattoos on his neck, goes by Tank. The bartender's expression didn't change, but his eyes flicked briefly toward the corner booth. "Never heard of him," he muttered, wiping down a glass. Morgan slipped another bill onto the counter. "You sure?" He hesitated, glancing toward the booth again before leaning in closer. "They were here earlier," he said in a low voice. "Left in a hurry when word got around the cops were sniffing. Heard him mention something about a warehouse on Fletcher Street. That's all I know." Morgan nodded, slipping him one more bill for good measure. "Thanks." She turned and left the bar, her mind already racing. Fletcher Street was in the industrial district, a maze of abandoned warehouses and forgotten factories. If Tank was hiding out there, it wouldn't be easy to find him, but it also meant he was running out of places to go. An hour later, Morgan crouched behind a stack of rusted shipping containers, her breath steady as she observed the warehouse. The building was dimly lit, its cracked windows glowing faintly from a single overhead bulb. Inside, shadows moved behind the glass, at least three, maybe more. She recognized one of them as Tank. His large frame was unmistakable even from a distance. Two men stood at the main entrance, one smoking a cigarette while the other shifted his weight nervously. Morgan's eyes scanned the area, her SEAL instincts kicking in. She noted potential entry points, blind spots, and the placement of the guards. It wasn't a full-scale operation, but it was enough to make her approach cautiously. Sliding around to the side of the warehouse, Morgan found a broken window partially hidden by overgrown bushes. Testing the frame carefully, she slipped inside, landing silently on the concrete floor. The air was stale, filled with the smell of oil and decay. She stayed low, moving from shadow to shadow as the faint murmur of voices guided her deeper into the building. From her vantage point, behind a stack of crates, she could see Tank standing near a makeshift table. Patchy Beard and another man sat nearby, their body language tense. A handful of others lingered in the shadows, their faces indistinct but their presence clear. "I told you we lay low until this blows over," Tank growled, his voice carrying across the room. "No more park jobs, not until I say so." Patchy Beard shifted uncomfortably. "People are asking questions," he muttered. "We're sitting Ducks let them ask, Tank snapped. We don't move until I say so. End of discussion. Morgan's jaw tightened as she listened. This wasn't just a gang, this was an operation. Tank was running things on the ground, but his orders were coming from somewhere higher up. Hendrik's name loomed in her mind, the missing piece she needed to tie everything together. Reaching into her pocket, she pulled out her phone and quickly typed a message to Sarah. Found him warehouse on Fletcher. Call Reyes now. She hit send and slipped the phone back into her pocket. Her eyes stayed on Tank as she adjusted her stance, readying herself. The police were on their way, but she wasn't leaving without answers. This wasn't over, not yet. Morgan's voice sliced through the tension in the warehouse like a knife. Tank, the room froze. Head snapped toward her, and for a moment there was only silence. Tank's eyes narrowed as he stepped forward, his massive frame casting a shadow across the table. Recognition flared in his expression, followed quickly by anger. You, he growled, his voice low and dangerous. You've got some nerve walking in here. Morgan stood tall, her expression calm but unyielding. We're going to have a conversation, Tank, and you're going to tell me everything I want to know. The men around the room exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado starting to crack. Tank's smirk returned, but it was forced, his confidence more of a mask than a reality. You think you can just waltz in here and make demands, he said, his tone mocking. You're outnumbered, lady. This ain't the park. Morgan took a step forward, her gaze locked on Tank. I'm not here to play games. Either you talk or you deal with me, and I promise the park was the easy version. The tension in the room thickened. Patchy Beard stood, his hands curling into fists while the others shifted uneasily. Tank's smirk faded, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. He was trying to gauge her, to decide if her confidence was real or just a bluff. What do you want? Tank asked finally, his voice laced with irritation. Morgan's voice was like steel. Who's calling the shots? Who's funding you? Tank let out a hollow laugh, but it didn't reach his eyes. You think I'm just going to hand you that kind of information? You're out of your mind. Morgan took another step forward, her tone colder. Now you're running out of time, Tank. The police are on their way, and when they get here you're going down. If you cooperate, maybe, just maybe, you'll get out of this with less than a life sentence. Patchy Beard glanced nervously at Tank. Cops, she's bluffing, he muttered. Though his voice wavered, Tank stared at her, his jaw tied for the first time. Morgan saw genuine UNC certainty in his eyes. You don't scare me, he said, though the words lacked conviction. You should be scared, Morgan replied, her tone sharp. Because when the cops get here this whole operation falls apart, and I'm betting Hendrik isn't the forgiving type. The mention of Hendrik's name sent a ripple through the room. One of the younger men visibly flinched while Patchy Beard shifted uneasily. Tank's eyes darkened and his fists clenched at his sides. You don't know what you're talking about, he spat. Don't I? Morgan shot back. I know Hendrik been using you to terrorize neighborhoods. I know he's been funding you through his shell companies, and I know he'll throw you under the bus the second you're a liability. So tell me, Tank, how much is your loyalty worth? Before Tank could respond, the faint sound of sirens pierced the air. The flashing red and blue lights outside the warehouse cast shifting shadows across the grimy walls. The gang's collective tension boiled over into panic. She wasn't bluffing, one of the younger men whispered, his voice trembling. Tank's composure cracked, his head snapped toward the exit, then back to Morgan. His rage was palpable, but it was laced with desperation. This isn't over, he snarled, taking a step toward her. Morgan didn't back down. Yes, it is. The front doors burst open and police officers stormed into the warehouse, their weapons drawn, police hands in the air. One officer shouted, his voice commanding. Tank hesitated for a split second, his fists trembling at his sides, but the sight of the officers moving in was enough to break him. With a growl of frustration, he raised his hands, glaring at Morgan with pure venom. You're going to regret this, he spat as two officers moved to cuff him. Morgan stepped back, her expression unreadable. No, Tank, you are. The gang was subdued one by one, their earlier bravado replaced by fear and resignation. Patchy Beard protested loudly as he was cuffed, but his voice was drowned out by the chaos of the police operation. The Younger men looked pale and shaken, their eyes darting nervously as they were LED. Outside, Officer Reyes entered the warehouse, his gaze sweeping the scene before landing on Morgan. "Looks like you found them," he said, a hint of admiration in his tone. "They weren't hard to find," Morgan replied evenly, though her body ached from the tension. Reyes nodded toward Tank, who was being let out in cuffs. "Think he'll talk?" Morgan's eyes followed Tank as he was escorted to a squad car. "He will, they all will. Hendricks not as untouchable as he thinks." Reyes's expression hardened. "Let's hope you're right, because this is just the start." Morgan exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment settling over her. The battle wasn't over, but for now the gang was off the streets and with them in custody. The real fight against the man pulling their strings was just beginning. The precinct was bustling when Morgan arrived the next morning. The hum of ringing phones, shuffling papers, and hurried conversations filled the air. Officers moved back and forth, some carrying files, others focused on the faces of the arrested gang members being processed. Morgan made her way to the conference room where Officer Reyes was waiting with a stack of files spread across the table. "We got them locked up," Reyes said as Morgan entered, "but Tank hasn't said a word. He's playing tough." Morgan folded her arms, her jaw tightening. "That won't last. He knows Hendrik won't save him. It's just a matter of making him realize it." Reyes gestured to a photo on the board, a surveillance image of Tank meeting a well-dressed man outside a construction site. "This is the closest connection we've got so far. The man in the photo is Thomas Kane, one of Hendrik's top associates. He's a middleman, handles most of the dirty work. If we can connect Ken to Tank, we've got a shot at Hendrik." Morgan studied the photo, her mind racing. "And Kane, is he in custody?" Reyes shook his head. "Not yet. We've got eyes on him, but he's careful. We're hoping Tank gives us something to work with." Morgan leaned over the table, her voice firm. "Then let me talk to him." Reyes hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Tank's dangerous and he's angry. He'll try to get under your skin." Morgan's expression didn't falter. "Let him try." A few minutes later, Morgan stepped into the cold, fluorescent-lit interrogation room. Tank sat at the table, his hands cuffed in front of him. His broad shoulders were hunched, his expression a mixture of defiance and exhaustion. He looked up as Morgan entered, his eyes narrowing. "Well, if it isn't the hero of the hour," he sneered. "What they send you in here to gloat?" Morgan pulled out the chair opposite him and sat down, her posture relaxed but her gaze unyielding. "No, Tank, I'm here to make you an offer." Tank laughed, the sound harsh and hollow. "An offer, lady? I don't think you understand how this works." "I understand perfectly," Morgan said, her voice calm. "I understand that Hendrik left you to rot. I understand that he won't lift a finger to help you because you're expendable. And I understand that if you don't talk, you're going down alone." Tank's smirk faltered for the briefest moment, but he recovered quickly. "You're bluffing. Hendrik's untouchable. You've got nothing." Morgan leaned forward, her tone sharp. "We have plenty. Your boy are already talking. Patchy Beard gave us everything we needed to tie you to the attacks. The younger guys, they're terrified. It's only a matter of time before they fold completely. The only question is whether you go down with them or give us what we need to take Hendrik out." Tank's jaw tightened, his fists clenching on the table. "You don't know what you're asking for. Hendrik's got people everywhere. If I talk, I'm as good as dead. If you don't talk, you'll spend the rest of your life in a cell." Morgan countered. "Hendrik won't protect you. The second you become a liability, you're gone. But if you help us, we can protect you. Witness protection, reduced charges. You'll get a chance to start over. It's more than Hendrik will ever give you." Tank stared at her, the weight of her words sinking in. The room was silent, the tension thick. Finally he exhaled sharply, slumping back in his chair. "What do you want to know?" he muttered, his voice bitter. Morgan didn't hesitate. "Hendrik, his operations, how he funds you, who he uses, and how he communicates." Tank's lips pressed into a thin line, but he began to speak. "It's all through his company's construction. Mostly he launders the money through contracts and sends it to us through shell accounts. We get our cut for doing the dirty work. The orders come through middlemen. Kane's one of them. I've met Hendrik maybe twice. He doesn't like to get his hands dirty." Morgan's gaze didn't waver. "The other groups, how many?" Tank hesitated then nodded reluctantly. There's a few same setup as us. We don't work together directly but we all know the deal. Keep people scared. Keep them out of his neighborhoods. And Kane Morgan pressed. Where is he now? Probably at his office, Tank said with a shrug. Hendrik got him running things. If anyone knows the full picture, it's him. Reyes stepped into the room, his expression grim but determined. He placed a folder on the table and opened it to reveal photos of Kane and financial documents linking Hendrik's companies to Tank's crew. This is enough to start, Reyes said, his voice steady. We'll cross-check everything, but if it holds up, we've got him. Tank slumped back in his chair, his defiance finally crumbling. You think this is over? He spat. You don't know what you're dealing with. Morgan stood, her gaze icy. Neither does Hendrik, but he's about to find out. As she left the room, the weight of Tank's words hung in the air. Hendrik wasn't just another criminal, he was running a machine, but now that machine had cracks and Morgan intended to tear it apart piece by piece. The sun was beginning to set when Morgan met Sarah at their usual coffee shop, a quiet corner in the city where plans often came together. The evidence from Tank's confession had already been handed over to Reyes, who was organizing a team to act on the leads. Morgan couldn't shake the feeling that every move they made was racing against time. Hendrik wouldn't sit still for long. Sarah had her laptop open, the glow of the screen reflecting her tired eyes. She tapped the table with a pen as Moore slid into the seat across from her. Rahia said, Tank gave you Kane's location, Sarah began without preamble. That's a huge win. Morgan nodded, her expression serious. If we can get C to talk, we'll have a direct line to Hendrik. He's the one handling the money, the orders, everything. Sarah's fingers flew across the keyboard as she pulled up documents, maps and photos. Kane's office is in the downtown financial district. It's AA front, of course. Officially it's a consulting firm, but I traced several transactions from Hendrik's companies to Kane's office account. It's clean on the surface, but the timing lines up perfectly with the activities of Tank's crew and the other groups. Morgan leaned in, scanning the data Sarah had compiled. He's the middleman. If we can get him to crack, Hendrik's entire operation falls apart. Sarah hesitated, her voice lowering. Kane's not like Tank. He's not a street thug. He's smart, calculated, and he has resources. If you confront him, he won't go down easily. Morgan's jaw tightened. I'm not looking for easy, I'm looking for answers. Later that evening, Morgan sat in an unmarked car with Reyes parked a block away from Kane's sleek office building. The structure stood out against the skyline, its modern design and gleaming glass facade a stark contrast to the corruption hidden inside. Reyes adjusted his earpiece, his eyes scanning the building through the windshield. We've got a team stationed at the back entrance and another on standby. If Kane's in there, he won't be leaving without us knowing. Morgan's focus remained sharp. Hune's in there, she said confidently. People like Kane don't stray far from their fortresses. He knows the walls are closing in. Reyes glanced at her, his expression concerned. You sure you're ready for this? Kane's not going to fold just because you walk in there. Morgan's eyes didn't waver. He'll fold, they always do. Moments later she stepped out of the car and made her way to the building's entrance, her movements deliberate and calm. The air felt heavy, the city's usual buzz seeming quieter than normal. As she entered the building, the receptionist glanced up, startled but professional. May I help you? The receptionist asked. I'm here to see Thomas Ken, Morgan said, her tone firm. The receptionist hesitated. Do you have an appointment? Morgan gave a faint smile that didn't reach her eyes. Number, but he'll want to see me. Before the receptionist could respond, Morgan's sharp gaze caught movement in her peripheral vision. A man in a tailored suit stepped into the lobby, his face carefully neutral. Thomas Kane. That's all right, Kane said smoothly, addressing the receptionist without taking his eyes off Morgan. I'll handle this. Morgan squared her shoulders as Kane approached, his demeanor calm and collected. He extended a hand, but she didn't take it. You must be M. Blake, he said, his tone polite but with a hint of disdain. I've heard about you. I'm sure you have, Morgan replied, her voice cold. We need to talk. Kane motioned toward the elevator, his smile thin. Then let's talk. The elevator ride to his office was tense, the silence filled with unspoken threats. Kane stepped out first, leading her into a pristine space filled with minimalist furniture and sleek decor. He gestured for her to sit, but Morgan remained standing. You've been busy, Kane began, pouring himself a drink. Your meddling cost me a few good men. Do you plan to keep this up? Morgan didn't flinch. I'm here to give you a chance. See, talk now and maybe you walk out of this with less than a life sentence. See laughed, the sound hollow. You think you can scare me? You're barking up the wrong tree, Miss Blake. Morgan's expression hardened. I know everything, the shell companies, the payments, the orders. I know Hendricks pulling the strings and you're his errand boy. The only question is how long you plan to stay loyal to someone who will drop you the second you're no longer useful. Kane's eyes flashed with irritation, but his smile didn't waver. You're clever, I'll give you that, but Hendrik is untouchable. Even if you take me down, someone else will take my place. That's how this works. Not this time, Morgan said firmly. We have enough to bring you in. The only question is whether you want to go down with Hendrik or help us bring him to justice. Kane's smile faded, his grip tightening on the glass in his hand. For the first time there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. You're playing a dangerous game, he said quietly. So are you, Morgan replied, but your time's up. Before C could respond, the sound of heavy boots echoed in the hallway. The door burst open and Reyes entered with a team of officers, weapons drawn. Thomas Kane, you're under arrest, Reyes announced, his voice steady. Kane's calm facade crumbled as he was cuffed, his protests drowned out by the officers reading him his rights. Morgan stepped aside, her gaze cold as she watched him being led away. Reyes turned to her, a hint of relief in his expression. We've got him now, we tie it all back to Hendrik. Morgan nodded, but her mind was already racing. Kane was in custody, but Hendrik wouldn't go down without a fight. The real battle was just beginning. The precinct was alive with activity as Kane sat in the interrogation room, his once confident demeanor shattered through the observation window. Morgan watched him fidget in his seat, his polished appearance now rumpled and undone. The man who had oozed arrogance just hours earlier now looked every bit as cornered as he was. Officer Reyes stood beside her, holding a thick file filled with financial records, transaction logs and surveillance photos. He's breaking, Reyes said, his voice low, but he's still holding back. He's more afraid of Hendrik than he is of us. Morgan's jaw tightened. Then we make him more afraid of what happens if he stays quiet. Reyes nodded, pushing the door open and stepping inside. Morgan followed her presence, instantly commanding the room. Kane's eyes darted toward her, and for a moment she saw the flicker of recognition. He knew she wasn't here to waste time. Mr. Kane, Reyes began, his tone measured, you're in a lot of trouble. The evidence we have on you is more than enough for a conviction, but we're willing to talk if you are. Kane scoffed, though the tremor in his voice betrayed his fear. You think I'm going to sell out Hendrik? You have no idea who you're dealing with. Morgan leaned forward, her voice cutting through the air like steel. We know exactly who we're dealing with, and we know Hendrik won't protect you. Right now you're nothing but a loose end to him. You really think he'll stick his neck out for you? Kane's facade cracked further, his gaze dropping to the table. You don't understand, he muttered. Hendrik isn't just some businessman, he has people everywhere, judges, cops, politicians. You take me down and it won't make a difference. Morgan's eyes narrowed. It will if we take him down with you, but that only happens if you start talking. Reyes slid the file across the table, opening it to reveal pages of incriminating evidence. This is what we already have: financial records tying Hendrik's companies to illegal activities, witnesses who can place you at meetings with gang leaders. And let's not forget your little operation on Fletcher Street. Kane's hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white against the edge of the table. You don't get it, he said through gritted teeth. If I talk, I'm dead. Hendrik will find me no matter where I go. Morgan's voice was sharp. No, not if we take him down first. Help us and we'll make sure you're protected. Witness protection, new identity, the works, or you can keep your mouth shut and spend the rest of your life in prison knowing Hendrik doesn't care whether you live or die. The silence in the room was suffocating as Kane wrestled with the weight of his decision. Beads of sweat dotted his forehead and his breathing quickened. Finally he exhaled shakily. Slumping back in his chair, "All right," he said quietly, "what do you want to know?" Reyes exchanged a glance with Morgan before pulling out a notepad. "Start with the structure. How does Hendrik run his operation?" Kane's voice was strained but steady as he spoke. "It's all through his company's construction consulting community initiatives. It all looks legit on paper, but the money moves through shell accounts. He uses them to fund the gangs, pay for supplies and keep everyone in line." "And communication?" Morgan asked, her tone unyielding. "How does he stay connected without leaving a trail?" "He doesn't talk to us directly," Kane admitted. "He uses middlemen like me to pass orders down the chain. Everything's encrypted, burner phones, coded emails. He's careful, but if you trace the money far enough it all leads back to him." Morgan's eyes locked on Kane. "What about locations? Where does he operate out of?" Kane hesitated, then muttered, "There's a private estate on the outskirts of town. That's where he holds his meetings. If you're looking for something big, that's your best shot." Reyes's pen flew across the page, capturing every word. "And the other groups, how many are there?" "Too many to count," Kane said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Hendrik's network spans the entire region. Each group operates independently, but they all answer to him. He's the hub." Reyes closed his notepad, his expression grim. "That's enough for now." Morgan stood, her gaze steady on Kane. "You've done the right thing, but if you're lying..." "I'm not," Kane interrupted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've already lost everything. I'm not risking what little I have left." As they left the room, Reyes turned to Morgan, his voice low. "This estate, C mentioned it could be the key to taking Hendrik down, but we'll need to move fast before he catches wind." Morgan nodded, her mind already racing with the next steps. "Then let's get to work. This ends with Hendrik." The clock was ticking and Morgan knew the next move would be the most dangerous yet, but if Kane's information held up, they were closer than ever to bringing Hendrik's empire crashing down. The operation to raid Hendrik estate began to take shape. Within hours, Reyes and his team gathered everything they needed: search warrants, tactical plans, and the evidence Kane had provided. The precinct was a hive of activity, with officers briefing each other, checking equipment and mapping out the sprawling estate that sat just outside the city. Morgan stood with Reyes in the conference room, staring at a large satellite image of the estate pinned to the wall. The property was vast, surrounded by high fence and dotted with security cameras. A private road snaked through dense trees to a gated entrance. It was the kind of place built to keep unwanted eyes out. "Hune's going to see us coming," Reyes said, his tone grim. "If this estate is as central to his operation as Kane says, Hendrik won't let us walk in without a fight." Morgan's expression was steely. "That's why we hit fast and hard. He won't have time to react." Reyes nodded. "We've got a team ready to breach the perimeter. You're coming with us?" Morgan met his gaze without hesitation. "I didn't come this far to sit on the sidelines." The plan was finalized as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the city in a blanket of twilight. By the time the convoy of unmarked police vehicles reached the edge of the estate, the darkness was complete. The team moved with practiced precision, their voices low over radios. As they approached the gate, Morgan crouched beside Reyes, scanning the property through night vision binoculars. She spotted 2 guards patrolling the main entrance and another near the side gate. 3 guards visible, she whispered. "There'll be more inside." Reyes signaled to his team, "We'll take out the perimeter quietly. Once the gate is open, we move in." Morgan watched as 2 officers slipped through the trees, their movements nearly silent. Within minutes, the guards at the gate were subdued, their weapons confiscated. The side gate was pried open and the team began advancing toward the main house. The estate loomed ahead, its large windows glowing faintly in the darkness. Morgan's heart pounded as they approached, her SEAL instincts kicking in. Every shadow, every faint noise could be a threat. She moved with precision, her eyes scanning for movement inside. Hendrik's operation was in full swing, the sounds of voices, and faint clinking of glasses drifted from the grand dining room through a window. Morgan spotted Hendrik himself. Seated at the head of a long table surrounded by a group of men in suits. Papers were spread across the table and Henrik's calm demeanor suggested he wasn't aware of what was coming. Reyes gave the signal and the team moved into position. The doors burst open with a deafening crash and chaos erupted. Police, hands in the air. Officers shouted, their weapons drawn as they poured into the room. HR's guests scrambled to their feet, some raising their hands, others reaching for their phones. Hendrik remained seated, his expression shifting from surprise to cold fury as his eyes landed on Morgan. "You," he muttered, his voice dripping with venom. Morgan stepped forward, her stance unyielding. "It's over, Hendrik." He leaned back in his chair, his smirk returning as if he were still in control. "You think this changes anything? Do you have any idea how deep this goes?" Morgan's voice was sharp, "Deep enough for you to be buried under it." As officers began collecting evidence from the room, papers, laptops and phones, one of Hendrik's men lunged toward an officer. Morgan reacted instantly, intercepting him with a swift movement that sent him sprawling to the ground. "Stay down," she ordered, her tone icy. Hendrik's calm facade finally cracked as officers cuffed him. "You're making a mistake," he snarled. "This is bigger than me. Taking me down won't stop it." Morgan leaned in, her voice low but unwavering. "You're right, but you're the start." The raid continued as officers searched the house and surrounding property. Hidden safes were uncovered, filled with financial records and encrypted devices. In a basement office they found a map marked with neighborhoods that had been targeted, proof of Hendrik's systematic operation to displace minority communities. By the time the team finished, the evidence against Hendrik was overwhelming. As he was led out in cuffs, his expression darkened. "You're wasting your time," he said, his voice a venomous hiss. "You'll never stop. What's coming?" Morgan watched him being loaded into the back of a squad car, her expression cold. "We already have." Reyes approached her, his face a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We've got enough to put him away for a long time. This is a win, Morgan." "It's a start," Morgan replied, her tone firm. She looked back at the estate, the weight of the night settling over her. Hendrik's empire was crumbling, but she knew the fight wasn't over. The networks he'd built ran deep and others would try to take his place, but for now she allowed herself a moment to breathe. They had taken down a man who had terrorized so many, and that was a victory worth holding on to. For now the precinct conference room was filled with a tense energy. The following morning the raid on Hendrik's estate had been a success and the evidence gathered was staggering. Officers, analysts and prosecutors worked side by side, piecing together the mountain of documents, digital files and witness statements. Hendrik's name was plastered across the whiteboard at the center of the room, circled in red with strings connecting him to his network of gangs and shell companies. Morgan sat at the corner of the table, her gaze fixed on the financial records Sarah had unearthed. The sheer scale of Hendrik's operation was staggering. The money laundering alone spanned multiple states with connections to political figures, business deals and extremist organizations. It was more than just a hate network, it was a web of corruption designed to funnel power and money into Hendrik's hands. Officer Reyes entered the room holding a tablet loaded with the latest findings. "We've traced some of the funds to offshore accounts," he said, addressing the group. "It's going to take time to untangle everything, but we've already identified payments linked to at least 3 other gangs in neighboring cities." Hendrik wasn't just running his operation locally, he was coordinating across state lines. Morgan's jaw tightened as she scanned the names on the board. "What about the other groups? Are they connected to Tank's crew?" Reyes nodded indirectly. "Hendrik kept them compartmentalized so none of the crews interacted directly, but the funds, the orders, they all trace back to him. It's a chain of command designed to insulate him from the day-to-day operations." Sarah, who had joined the meeting with her laptop in hand, tapped the screen to pull up another document. "I've been cross-referencing the files we found at the estate," she said. "Henrik wasn't just using these groups for intimidation, he was using them to influence local policies, buying off council members, blocking housing initiatives that would stabilize the neighborhoods he wanted to take over. The room fell silent as the weight of her words sank in. This wasn't just about hate crimes, it was about systemic corruption on a scale they hadn't fully grasped before. What about Hendrik himself? Morgan asked, her voice steady. Has he said anything? Reyes shook his head. Not a word. He's lawyered up and his defense team is already put in back there, claiming the evidence was obtained illegally, trying to get the charges dismissed before they even hit court. Morgan leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. Then we need to make sure our case is airtight. Every document, every witness, every connection, we need to lock it down. If Hendrik walks, it'll be a signal to everyone like him that they can get away with this. Reyes gave a small nod. We're already working on it, but it's going to take time. As the team continued their discussions, Morgan's phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen. A message from an unknown number. You think this is over? You don't know who you're dealing with. Her eyes narrowed as she showed the message to Reyes. Looks like Hendrik's people are already trying to rattle us. Reyes frowned, taking the phone and examining the message. It's probably from one of his associates. They're scared and they're lashing out, but it means we're getting close. Morgan's voice was cold. Let them be scared, it's nothing compared to what they've done to others. Later that evening, Morgan sat at her desk at home, her laptop glowing softly as she reviewed the latest evidence. Sarah's notes and the precinct's files were spread out in front of her, each one a piece of the puzzle. Despite the progress they'd made, she couldn't shake the feeling that Hendrik had planned for this. He was too methodical, too calculated to be taken off guard completely. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a call from Sarah Morgan. Sarah began, her voice tense. I've been digging deeper into the accounts. We found there's one payment that doesn't match the others, a huge exchange to a confidential record only days before the strike. It seems to be Hendrik was attempting to move cash out before we got to him. Where did it go? Morgan asked, her psyche dashing it seaward. Sarah answered, however, here's the things, it's not only a payout, it's a withdrawal for a property. Hendrik was setting up a contingency plan. Morgan's temple wrinkled. What sort of property? A compound, Sarah said horridly. It's secluded, intensely got and right external, the purview of our ongoing examination. Morgan breathed out leisurely, the weight of the disclosure settling over her. Hendrik wasn't simply covering his tracks, he was planning for a most pessimistic scenario situation, and presently she realized he wouldn't stop until he modified what they destroyed. Send me the subtleties, Morgan said, her voice firm. In the event that Hendrik's wanting to take action, we want to stop him before he vanishes. As the get back to finished, Morgan inclined in her seat, her psyche previously managing the potential outcomes. Hendrik had misjudged them once, however she realized this was a long way from over. Assuming he figured he could get away from, he was going to figure out how wrong he was. The following morning, Morgan remained with Reyes and a little team in a segregated preparation room at the region. The compound Sarah had revealed was shown on the screen, a rambling property settled in the forest miles from the closest town, its high fences, reconnaissance cameras, and decisively put monitor towers clarified this wasn't a country estate, it was a fortification. This is where Hune's wanting to refocus, Morgan said, her voice consistent. Be that as it may, firm. Assuming that he arrives, we'll lose him, he'll reconstruct, and all that we've done will be in vain. Reyes gestured, his demeanor horrid. We have a restricted window. The monetary exchange Sarah found shows Hendrik's been setting up this backup for quite a long time. We don't have any idea the number of individuals he's positioned there, however it's most likely the case he's not going alone. The guide moved on the screen, focusing in on the compound's format. It showed a fundamental structure encompassed by more modest stations with a solitary access street driving in and out. The thick timberland around the property made a secrecy approach conceivable, however the absence of perceivability represented its own dangers. We'll part into two groups, Reyes proceeded with. One will make a redirection at the front entryway while different breaks the edge from the east. Morgan, you'll be With the break group, Morgan's eyes checked the guide, remembering everything about. What's the course of events? Reyes checked his watch. We moved this evening. Hendrik will not sit still for a really long time, and we can't stand to allow him to vanish. Night fell rapidly, the thick shade of trees around the compound gulping the twilight. Morgan squatted with her group close to the eastern wall, her body tense and prepared. The hints of the woods encompassed them, stirring leaves, far-off creature calls. However, her attention was on the weak sparkle of the compound ahead. Through her earpiece, Reyes' voice came through. Redirection group ready. Back up. Morgan changed her hold on her weapon, her pulse consistent yet fast. The wall lingered ahead, a tall boundary finished off with razor wire behind it. She could make out the shadowy types of monitors watching the border go. Reyes told the weak sound of gunfire reverberated from the front of the compound, followed by yells and the blasting of alerts. The watchmen at the eastern side wavered, their consideration moving toward the clamor. It was the initial Morgan's group required. They moved quickly, slicing through the wall and slipping inside undetected. The ground was lopsided, the landscape dabbed with hedges and dissipated flotsam and jetsam. Morgan drove the manner in which her developments, determined and calm ahead. The primary structure increasingly posed a threat, its windows sparkling faintly. Principal working inside, Morgan murmured into her earpiece. Moving in, the group progressed, keeping low. As they moved toward the side entry, a solitary watchman remained close to the entryway, his weapon threw lethargically behind him. Morgan motioned toward one of her colleagues, who brought him down quietly with a speedy strike. Inside, the structure was frightfully calm, the thick walls muting the turmoil outside. Morgan's group traveled through the corridors, clearing each room purposefully. The style was inadequate, the walls lined with file organizers and reconnaissance screens. It was anything but a home, it was a war room. Through an entryway, Morgan spotted development. Hendrik was there, remaining at a work area heaped with records and a PC shining splendidly. He was flanked by two monitors, their stances tense as they paid attention to his fast requests. Morgan didn't hold back. She ventured into the room, her weapon raised. Hendrik pulled back from the work area. The gatekeepers responded in a split second, coming to for their weapons. However, Morgan's group was quicker. Shots rang out and the gatekeepers fell before they could discharge. Hendrik froze, his hands gradually raising as he went to confront Morgan. This is inconsequential, he spat, his voice loaded up with toxin. You think bringing me down will stop this? You're an idiot. Morgan's look was cold, immovable. We'll see about that. Hands where I can see them, Hendrik jeered, yet gone along his developments, purposeful as Morgan's group limited him. She moved to the work area, her eyes checking the PC screen. Documents were open, email sends, exchange logs and encoded messages. It was a mother lode of proof. We have what we want, she said into her earpiece. Hendrik's in authority, and we've gotten the records. Reyes' voice came through, loaded up with help. Duplicate that. We're wrapping up at the front. Great work. As Hendrik was accompanied out, his eyes ignited with scorn. However, Morgan didn't falter. She had confronted men like him before, men who flourished with dread and power, yet this evening she had stripped him of both. As the group moved throughout the compound, gathering each piece of proof they could find, Morgan remained external, observing. As Hendrik was stacked into a vehicle, his realm had fallen, and this time there was no way out. The court was loaded, the air weighty with expectation. As Hendrik found a spot at the respondent's table, his once perfect suit presently appeared as though an ensemble, his certain disposition supplanted by the inflexible stance of his man. Destruction was inescapable around him. Legal counselors murmured irately their endeavors to stifle proof and ruin observers, unwinding with each new disclosure. Morgan sat discreetly toward the rear of the court, her eyes fixed on the procedures. She wasn't one for festivities, yet watching the arraignment spread out Hendrik's wrongdoings harmony by piece with the proof she and the group had contended energetically to get brought her a peaceful feeling of fulfillment. The indictment's case was water-air proof. They point by point how Hendrik's shell organizations had piped cash into disdain gatherings and posses, how he had utilized dread and terrorizing to uproot weak networks and how he had tainted authorities to protect himself from responsibility. A large number of witnesses affirmed, including Kane, who hesitantly affirmed Hendricks' job as the driving force behind it all when the arraignment introduced the reports from Hendricks' home and compound. There was a discernible change in the room. The sheer size of his activities paralyzed even the most prepared court eyewitnesses. Guides, monetary records, scrambled messages generally attached back to HRI. The proof was overpowering. As the appointed authority declared a break, Hendrick went to frown at Morgan, his demeanor venomous. She met his look without jumping, her quiet certainty an unmistakable difference to his developing franticness. Briefly it appeared as however he needed to talk, yet he dismissed, his shoulders drooping. Outside the town hall, columnists amassed the means, their cameras blazing as they yelled questions. Morgan moved past them without a word, her emphasis on Reyes and Sarah, who stood holding up close to a police vehicle that was serious. Sarah said, her tone a blend of fatigue and when they're calling this one of the greatest defilement cases in many years. Reyes gestured, his demeanor serious yet feeling better. Hendricks done, regardless of whether he some way or another squirms out of some of the charges. The public aftermath alone will destroy him. He has no organization left, no partners. Morgan rested up against the vehicle, folding her arms. Great, yet this isn't the end. There are still others like him, individuals who figure they can pull off utilizing dread and ability to control others. Sarah put a hand on Morgan's shoulder. Perhaps, however, what you've done here it matters. You've given individuals motivation to retaliate. Reyes looked at her, an uncommon grin pulling at his lips. You're an awe-inspiring phenomenon, Blake. Don't think we might have done this without you. Morgan shrugged, her look far off. It wasn't simply me, it was us all, and presently it's on everybody to ensure this doesn't occur again. As the group outside the town hall started to thin, Morgan strolled toward the recreation area where everything started. The sun was set, projecting a warm shine over the trees and seats. She found a similar place where she had sat weeks prior. The recollections of that game-changing day still new to her. Youngsters chuckled somewhere out there, their light-hearted bliss an indication of why she had contended energetically the world was flawed. Be that as it may, today it was somewhat better compared to it had been. Hendrick's realm had fallen. Furthermore, individuals he had harmed could at long last start to recuperate. Morgan breathed out leisurely, a faint grin getting her lips. The battle wasn't finished yet. Until further notice, she permitted herself a snapshot of harmony. She had done what she set off to do, and that was enough until further notice. Assuming you partook in this story, remember to like this video, share your contemplations in the remarks underneath, and buy into this feed for more stories like this. Gratitude for watching, and see you in the following one.